So, keeping that in mind, what is Satan trying to do? He's trying to accomplish exactly what the prophet said he would do, and I'll now read two prophecies out of the hundreds that I could quote. The first one being from Ether, chapter 8, beginning with verse 23. Before reading this, I should also give you another verse, Mormon 8, verses 34 to 35, where Moroni says, "You Gentiles of the last days, I have seen you, and I have seen your times." And here's what he said. "Wherefore, O ye Gentiles, it is wisdom in God that these things should be shown unto you, that thereby ye may repent of your sins, and suffer not these murderous combinations shall get above you, which are built up to get power and gain, and the work, yea, even the work of destruction come upon you, yea, even the sword of the justice of an eternal God." I want to pause there after that verse to comment on this. First of all, I want you to notice great secret combinations moving abroad in the earth, all of them trying to do one thing. Do what Satan wants done, and that's destroy the power in the people and replace it with ruler's law, a ruler that will obey Satan. Now that's what's happening. These secret combinations are in every facet of our lives. They are in both of the major political parties of the United States, to begin with. This is very easy to document. They are in education, and that is very easy to document, as they try to seize control of the schools away from parents and dictate to the next generation what they shall learn in terms of what these other people think is for their good. It is in the labor movement, and there are a lot of wonderful people in the laboring movement, but the labor power is determined to get a veto-proof Congress, which means it will obey our dictates and support our class and none others. That's what a veto-proof Congress is supposed to mean. And you can be against that without being against labor. It is in the churches, and I know of no greater subversive satanical force in the world today than the World Council of Churches. There isn't anything Christ stood for that they aren't opposed to of any significance, that is. It is involved in our programs of welfare, which is supposed to be a system of compassion, and President McKay said it was the most diabolical device for grasping power. It was not a program of compassion. It was based on a different principle entirely. It's among our super rich. They are determined to destroy the Constitution of the United States and set up a one world order, President Nixon's favorite phrase. We had 134 congressmen and senators sign a Declaration of Interdependence, all designed to overthrow the Constitution of the United States. Well, it's in almost every facet of our lives. The next verse I want to read is verse 24 from Ether 8. "Wherefore the Lord commandeth you." Who's he commanding? The Gentile saints of the latter days. "The Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things come among you, that ye shall awake to a sense of your awful situation, because of this secret combination which shall be among you. Or woe be unto it because of the blood of them who have been slain." And Moroni saw that this would lead to terrible bloodshed. Now, in 1973, the New York Times came out with an article, and it said that Mao Zedong was probably the most moral, spiritual, innovative leader of the century. Who do you think would make a statement like that about Mao Zedong, who admitted murdering 12 million people, and congressional reports based on sworn testimony by people who were over there raised the estimate to closer to 64 million? Who do you think in the United States would call that kind of a man a great spiritual moral leader? The greatest. That's David Rockefeller, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank, head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and probably the most prestigious political and economic personality in the whole world. There is no one who can walk into any embassy or any prime minister's office unannounced. I don't know of any other person who can do it, but David Rockefeller can. He's the younger of the Rockefeller brothers. What's he trying to do? He has a plan. He wants to restore ruler's law and force the stupid masses, those are Lenin's words, force the stupid masses to do what's good for them. He has the highest aspirations for the human family. He would force all of them to be well-housed, well-educated, and well-fed, on the assumption that then they will all reach the celestial kingdom, or whatever he believes in. In order to help these people, you must approach them on the basic assumption that they're sincere. They're so sincere that some of them would give their very lives to achieve this great monolithic monster of power that we all voted against in the pre-existence. The great revolution of the pre-existence is continuing here on earth. Satan won a third of our brothers and sisters up there, and it's amazing how many are willing to subscribe to those principles here. Well, Moroni says, I, Moroni, am commanded to write these things that evil may be done away, and that the time may come that Satan may have no power upon the hearts of the children of men. Now, there's an optimistic note. Now, at Kansas City, that was clearly the issue. We had a candidate who was opposed to this strong centralization of authority in Washington, and another one who was willing to kind of roll along with it. He talks against it at election time, but other than that, contributes greatly to it. The one who stood for people's law had the most delegates, but because of a technicality where some states have to vote the majority, it locked up enough delegates so that the man in favor of centralized power won, and he represented the Republican Party. At the Democratic Convention, with practically no resistance, was one who represented total centralization of authority, a program of national health, and some other things that have been tried scores of times all over the world, haven't worked anywhere to my satisfaction anyway. Some others may feel differently, but I've watched it in Sweden and South America and England. And any doctor who's here who thinks he'll do better under socialized medicine just needs to take a trip and talk to some of those who've had to work under it. But anyway, that's what he's promised. As of this moment, it appears that the American people have chosen that route. This may work out to an advantage. I have great confidence in the American people. They can be suckered in down to just a certain point. And I use that word advisedly, because it means being lured, suckered in, taking the bait. And I've watched these political baits swallowed by our people, which I myself would have swallowed, because they were all the good things that everybody wants, had not I been alerted because of my professional assignment that this bait, although pure protein, bite-sized, had a hook in it. And I was so thrilled when I found out that the Founding Fathers anticipated practically everything bad that's happened to the United States and gave us a formula for our recovery. We got some good news for this world, but our people don't know it yet. And that's why President Clark kept saying, we don't need any more prophets for the moment. We just need some listening ears among the saints. So I say to the students, you ready to study? You want to help save the Constitution? At this point, you won't even know who to vote for, or who stands for the Constitution, probably. We need to humbly sit down and start studying. All right, now will you remember those two prophecies? That there will be secret combinations to establish rulers' power in our day, and that God called upon the saints of the last days to repent and stop sustaining these secret combinations. And we have a command to overthrow them while we still have the capacity to do it. Now, that's enough background, and I hope enough of a foundation so that we can now discuss the history of my lifetime in terms of those two prophecies, because that's what I'm going to do. And Brother Ludlow's absolutely right. When I deal with history, I have to give it to you in terms of my best thinking as I have seen it, fortunately not as a young debater in college where I was winning debates on the wrong side, but as a result of 16 years in the FBI and another 25 or 30 years studying every document I could get my hands on both sides. Now, anything that I say in this lecture today is documented. Naturally, I didn't bring a library to cite everything. But if you're taking notes, you have any question about any point that I make, and write me at BYU, I'll be very glad to send you the documentation. Actually, most of it is in 3 different books, which I'll mention in a moment. Now let me just tell you the history of the conspiracies, the great secret combinations to restore ruler's law in the United States. And I so appreciate your staying awake when it's so warm in here. And you are awake, and I'm grateful to you, because you can't remember it if you don't hear it. And one of the problems we've had is perspective. We don't have any frame of reference. Somebody comes along and says, well, of course, you know, our participation in World War I was set up for us. What? Yeah, it was set up for us. We never would have gotten into World War I without a lot of preparation, and forcing us into it. You're kidding. No, I'm not kidding. All the investigations reveal it. Tell me more. Well, then you've got a frame of reference from then on. You know that World War I was an unnecessary expenditure of money and manpower by the United States. And that's just the beginning. All right. If there were time, I would give you the root history of the secret combination as it grew up among the super rich. It extends over about 400 years. If I had time, I would give you the story and the history of the secret combination that grew up in the intellectual circles of the academic world, which extended over a period of about 200 years. And so on. I could give you the history of each one of these, but that's not so important as the fact that they all combined their strength and came to power the year I was born. 1913. I mean, one calamity hit us after another. Beginning in 1913. And little did I know, when I saw the light of day up in that little brown house in Raymond, Alberta, Canada, with the temperature 40 degrees below zero, that all these things had already been planted and established in the very year of my birth, which would affect the whole history of the world in the future. In 1913, the power structure not only took over the politics of the country, and it was an election which was very carefully manipulated. In fact, I ought to pause long enough to tell you that the incumbent president, Taft, was opposed to all of these things, and therefore great effort was made to eliminate him. They went to a member of his own party named Teddy Roosevelt and said, "You're the man. We'll give you money. Run independent. Smash Taft." And Teddy took the bait. Bite-sized, pure protein, full of hooks. And as a result, he split the party, and that allowed them to throw a lot of money behind the president of Princeton University named Woodrow Wilson, who was a benign, lovable sort of person, wanted to help the world, and took counsel from the worst people possible, and was elected president. But anyway, that's just a word about J. Edgar Hoover, who by this time was most disturbed by what was happening. Well, J. Reuben Clark was not listened to in or out of the church. And I watched my contemporaries wander away from conference and say, "Oh, I wish he'd stay out of politics." And some of those same people later lost their boys unnecessarily in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in Europe, and on the islands of the Pacific. Now, when we don't have ears to listen to the prophets, we pay penalties. The problem of cause and effect. So by 1941, we're in the war. We've got ourselves a Pearl Harbor. The investigation of Pearl Harbor is so morbid, the way the thing was set up, it was just like the Lusitania. And it was so bad that General Marshall went horseback riding so he wouldn't even be available when it hit. One of my partners in the FBI was the principal conductor of the investigation, much of which has never been published. but it was another trap, just like J. Reuben Clark said it would be, to involve us unnecessarily in foreign quarrels. And I ask you today, what did it accomplish? All of Eastern Europe that we fought to save from the Nazis was subsequently given by the State Department to the Communists. And at the Helsinki Convention, just, last June, it was admitted that that was all Soviet territory now. We wouldn't even pretend that the captive nations were even entitled to freedom. Now just kind of keep in mind that this is all being manipulated by people that have in mind a great new society, a one world order. It's down the trail. You've just begun to see it. The most I can share with you today is what the prophet said. And you read Ether, and you look around and say, no, not in my day. Yes, in your day. Even before you were born, it was operating. What are you going to do about your children's day? That's really the question. Now some people say, I'm sorry I don't have time to study this. That's why we're in the mess we're in. We couldn't even hardly get a handful of people to sit down, like the prophet asked them to, and give a high priority to spending a little time so that they could call the shots themselves. And that's what I say to my students. You shouldn't have to have anybody doing your thinking for you. You ought to be able to flip the paper and say, there he goes. Yeah, that's the man. There he goes. Now, you should know this, that during World War II, we were set up with the Soviet Union as our ally as part of the long-range program. Toward the latter part of the war, it was agreed that all of the Far East, including China, Southeast Asia, would go to Russia, or be in the Russian sphere of influence. That was all spring of 1945. Even before that, we found that Harry Hopkins, assistant to the president, had shipped about 1/2 of our uranium salt supply to the Soviet Union with the very latest information on how to construct the bomb from the Manhattan Project. It all came out in congressional hearings. Where were the American people? They certainly weren't listening. Harry Hopkins died, so nothing much was done about it, but the Rosenbergs were executed. And if you want to read a blistering sentence statement, read the Jewish judge and what he said to the Rosenbergs, who were also Jewish. As he said, in the names of the untold millions who may yet die because you have put into the hands of potential criminals through your duplicity this terrible instrument of destruction, I sentence you to die. Now they have their children appearing, weeping on the television, pleading with us to somehow undo this terrible mistake that was done to the Rosenbergs. The only mistake that was made is that we never went beyond the Rosenbergs to fix the guilt in the White House, in the State Department, and in the Congress, because there were Americans who knew exactly what was being done and supported the whole subversive movement. As we came out of World War II, they gave us the United Nations. When J. Reuben Clark spoke against it at the University of Utah, he was booed. Everybody was for the United Nations, and he said, so am I. But this charter happens to violate everything the Founding Fathers were inspired to set up for free people. It will abuse the little nations, and it will exploit the big ones. In the next 7 years, we lost an average of 100 million allies per year between the State Department and the United Nations program. All those people we'd fought and bled for to save from Nazism were slid under the Iron Curtain. And our ambassador from Poland was so upset and outraged that he resigned and wrote a book called I Saw Poland Betrayed. We had other State Department officials rushing up to the congressional committees and testifying. And then the presidents began pulling what became known as executive privilege, which said, if they want this information from our files, and they want to see our records, they must subpoena the president. And no president has ever been subpoenaed to appear before these congressional committees. It's just one of those things. It was used by Truman, used by Eisenhower, used by Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, when the congressional committees tried to tell the American people all the morbid details of what was happening and had the people ready to testify. So this was a complete frustration of the constitutional process. Well, I don't have much more bad news to tell you, but let me wind it up here just a little. As we came into 1950, you had three people primarily responsible for these tremendous losses. That is, they were the hatchet men. Back of them was a whole cadre of power. But you had Dean Acheson, General Marshall, and Harry Hopkins doing most of the manipulating and so forth. In 1950, Dean Acheson has become Secretary of State. He announces in January that neither Korea nor Formosa are any longer within the perimeter of defense of the United States, which obviously was inviting Russia to take whichever one they wanted. It had been promised to them at Yalta, and he wanted to get it over with. We had just lost China in 1948 and 49. And I guess I should tell you a little bit about that before I tell about the Korean War, because China was the top tragedy. Do I have any political science majors here, like myself, in this audience? Any political science majors? Any of you who took political science? We have one or two. Senator Clyde. Any others? All right. You were probably told what I was told, that Chiang Kai-shek was a terrible person, that he was corrupt, that he was holding 600 million Chinese together with bribes, etc., etc. Now, at the end of World War II, General Wedemeyer was sent in to take over the Chinese theater. The State Department said, we've got to be nice to Chiang. Let's plow around him. He knows nothing about the war. He is corrupt. So General Wedemeyer went in to see him. And if you want to read an exciting book, read Wedemeyer Reports, which was published in 1958. He said, I sat down with that little man, and within 20 minutes, I knew I was talking to the best military mind in the Far East, who knew more about that war than anybody I'd talked to so far, including the former commander. And I met with him for 1 or 2 hours every day thereafter, and he and I won that war together. And when the war was over, I said to Chiang before I departed from that territory, what could we do to help you? And Chiang said, I have had a constitution written, copied after that of the United States, and I want you to do for China what you did for the Philippines. Put an umbrella over us and protect us until our people have one generation of education so they know how to govern themselves. Do it for us like you did it for the Philippines, and we'll have a United States of China. Wedemeyer said, I know that that's what our country will want to do, and went home. Constitution was written, was barely being presented to the people, and who arrives on the scene but General Marshall, who says to Chiang Kai-shek, allow Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai into your government in charge of half of the ministries, including internal security and military police, several others. They're all key spots. And that will make the Soviet Union happy, and we've promised them that they will do this. Chiang said, look, General, before I was ever an ally of yours, I fought communists alone. And I'd fight them alone again before I'd ever turn my country over to the communists, which your program would ultimately result in. I would never get a free constitution for the Chinese people, which I want to provide. General Marshall said then, with a stroke of a pen, I disarm 39 divisions of your army, which he did, and cut off all military aid to China. At the very same moment, Russia was pouring all of the arms that had been captured from Japan into Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. As a result, the 4 million man army of Chiang Kai-shek suddenly found itself with tanks and no gas, planes and no rockets or bombs, guns with no bullets, and they just had to make a massive retreat. Wedemeyer was sent back by Truman in 1947 to see what in the world was going wrong in China, which we thought was in good shape. And when Wedemeyer came back in a state of mental shock and told the President what was happening, General Marshall rushed to the President and said, we got a very delicate relationship with Russia. There's too much at stake. We've got to go along with their policy. Don't let Wedemeyer talk. And so Wedemeyer was gagged, didn't talk to the press or to Congress, which he now feels was a mistake. He feels he should have resigned and talked anyway, but as a result, and I've got a picture of the memorandum which President Truman signed on the side, concurring in General Marshall's recommendation. So by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek had been forced to Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and the whole mainland of 600 million Chinese was taken over by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Now, any time I talk to a political scientist who has been brainwashed the same way I was in the California schools where I was brainwashed, and tells me what a terrible man Chiang Kai-shek was, if he's a Latter-day Saint, I say, where are the Chinese hearing the gospel? Well, several places. San Francisco, right. Where else? Hong Kong under the British, right. Where else? Guess that's all. How about Taiwan? Oh yeah, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek. Where is free enterprise operating in the Far East more effectively and efficiently than any area outside of Japan? Any area outside of Japan? I don't know. It's Taiwan. One of the very few nations that turned to the United States years ago and said we don't need any more economic aid. Military aid we have to have, but not economic aid. We're self-sufficient. If Chiang Kai-shek had stayed in charge of the mainland of China, you'd have missions all over among those 600 million people. And so I say to Latter-day Saints who are still brainwashed on Chiang Kai-shek, history has caught up with you. Don't pump that line anymore. Chiang would have been the greatest blessing to this church and to the Chinese people that was available at that time. Well, by 1950, we got ourselves in the Korean War as a result of our Secretary of State inviting Russia to go ahead and fulfill our commitments which were made at Yalta, that they could have Taiwan, they can have Korea, all that territory belongs to them. Southeast Asia, go ahead. It was an invitation to attack. And when it hit, the American people wouldn't take it, President Truman wouldn't take it. He ordered troops in unconstitutionally, as it turned out, actually. He ordered our troops up into South Korea, and they arrived after nothing was left except a little beachhead at Pusan. He promised to get all kinds of aid to MacArthur. So MacArthur went in on the assumption he'd be getting aid right away. None of it came. He couldn't figure out what had happened. Finally, he found Washington was as much of an opponent as North Korea. He couldn't get anything through. The president later was as confused as anyone else because he didn't know his State Department had been shipping all of the stuff to Europe. The money had been appropriated. The material had been obtained, and the State Department shipped it to Europe. That's how complicated things get in Washington. Finally, MacArthur said, we've got to make some kind of a surprise attack, so he went up the coast near the 38th parallel and made a surprise landing over a 3-day period that caught most of the flower of the North Korean army under Russian generals down in the southern part of Korea. He cut straight across, knocked out all of their logistics supplies. I'll knock the smithereens out of them. But the Red Chinese knew what General MacArthur didn't know, that he wasn't going to drop any blockbusters on the mainland of China. He wasn't even going to go over there with a BB gun. We could be attacked by their planes, and our planes couldn't chase them back to their bases. We had to stop the moment that we reached the supply line. As a result, our boys were all pushed down to Pusan, and from December of 50 until April of 51, we were just hammered to pieces, and Americans knew nothing about it. Until one congressman wrote a letter to General MacArthur and said, what are all these casualty lists coming through? Isn't this war supposed to be over? And General MacArthur unloaded in a 14-page letter, I've forgotten the exact number of pages. It was a big, long letter. And he told the congressman anyway all about it. And the congressman had the audacity to go down on the floor of the Congress and read the whole letter. That MacArthur had been gagged. He thought he could talk to a congressman. He was not allowed to tell the press what was happening to our American boys, and as a result, it was embarrassing to the President. The State Department insisted that Truman fire MacArthur, and he came home. I was in San Francisco the night he arrived, and he was sick at heart as he came home. He'd been he had lost all commands. As he landed in San Francisco, the crowds were so tremendous the car could only move inches at a time through the people to the hotel. And that's when he took a little encouragement that maybe there was left in the American people a little of that intestinal fortitude that would eventually bring the politicians to toll and get us back on the track. Well, he used to say old soldiers never die, they just fade away, and that's what happened to MacArthur. He was old by now, wasn't really much more he could do. He told his story over and over again, but that was the Korean War. Well, as you know, our people were in quite a tither by 1952. When our people are unhappy, they want to change. And they had the man that was going to blow the lid off of this whole thing. J. Reuben Clark was so excited, he says, now we'll get the story. We'll get Senator Taft in there as president. He knows this whole secret combination set up, and our people will hear what has been done to them these many years. And so our people all went back to the National Convention to elect Senator Taft. An amazing thing happened. Almost immediately after all of the Republicans got back to their convention, who appears but some of the most radical left of unions, of the press, very prominent people out of the government, and they would buttonhole the various state chairmen. They'd say, look, we've got to have a change, no doubt about it. Country can't stand this anymore. We've got to get out of that Korean War. Everything's in a mess. We want to change. And we'll support you. You will? Republicans have been out of power since 1932. I mean, it'd be nice to be back. You mean you'll support us? Yeah, we've got to have a change for the sake of America. Well, that's just great. Well, get behind us. We're going to put Taft in. No. We'll never support Taft. If you want our support, you've got to get somebody else. Well, who would you support? Well, you take somebody popular, like Ike Eisenhower. Oh, would you support Ike? Yes. Ike, huh? Yeah, think about that a little bit. The whole country would support Ike. Everybody loves Ike. Boy, I'll tell you, those Republican strategists got into a smoke-filled room, and within 24 hours, the candidate had shifted from Taft to Eisenhower, a registered Democrat who was a very great fighter against Nazism and wide open to communism. Later admitted, when I talked to Zhukov about the advantages of communism, I really couldn't think of anything to answer him. You can't meet Ike Eisenhower, or couldn't have met Ike, without being very impressed by him. Just a nice guy. And one day I gave a speech in Seattle, one night, to a rather large audience, and I told the life of Eisenhower. And how he sort of fell for this thing, did just exactly what they wanted him to, participated in one event after another that went right along toward this big cave-in that they were gradually building, used his good offices and the confidence the people had in him to do certain things that I'm sure the candidate from the other side probably couldn't have gotten away with. When I got all through, a little tiny fellow, about 80 years old, came up and said, Mr. Skousen, that was an interesting talk. Where'd you get all that information? I said, well, I've been gathering it over the years. He said, you know, some of that's, I didn't think anybody knew that, but Ike's family. Oh, I said, no, there's nothing that I've said that isn't public. Well, he says, I always used to tell Ike that he and one of my other brothers who became President John Hopkins, they just had the wrong approach. He said, they've always been for this big one-world thing. And he says, very interesting to me. Have you talk about my brother and give the real story, the way he really was. This was Edgar Eisenhower. But anyway, he said, that's the way it really has been. Well, that's as much as I have to tell. Ike went in, did his bit, and we succeeded in losing Cuba beautifully, carefully manipulated. Maybe you've forgotten that Ike's State Department sponsored Castro, foisted him onto the Cuban people. Did you remember that? Cubans didn't want him. Our ambassador came up and pleaded with the man that was on the Cuban desk For heaven's sakes, what are you doing back in Castro? Ezra Taft Benson pleaded with Eisenhower to take another approach. No, it was going to be Castro. Make Russia happy. That really is what lost the election for Richard Nixon. I was a delegate in 1960. I talked to Richard Nixon. I asked him all about Cuba. He told me everything I wanted to hear. Oh, we're going to liberate Cuba. Don't blame me for the Eisenhower policy. I was against it. Ezra Taft Benson had already warned me that this man will tell you anything you want to hear. Political animal, completely. And he told me everything I wanted to hear. A little later on, he told some friends of mine just the opposite. Detente. Got to go for detente. Anyway, he wasn't elected. John Kennedy, one of the most tragic presidents in the history of the United States, was elected, immediately surrounded by all the big people from the Council on Foreign Relations representing the power structure. And they manipulated him into a position that was just brutal, ultimately led to his assassination, I personally think, by a group out of Cuba. There are a lot of details on that are kind of interesting. Then came President Johnson, which I consider equally tragic, as he actually sacrificed his political career to try and satisfy the big power people. And he got himself so completely discredited he couldn't even run again. And if I told you the story in 1968 election, that's almost equally incredible. But I have to stop now because the time is running out and tell you one final thing in conclusion.